Hi everyone and welcome. Today I would like to talk to you about enumeration, the next step in the pen testing procedures. So the first thing that we want to think about is what is enumeration? Now, the previous topic is recon or reconnaissance, and that was where we were gathering the data. Enumeration is where we actually take the data that we gathered and then start using it. So Recon will have us look at the entire picture of the whole company. The enumeration is where we start to actually take that data and create what's called a battle plan. So this battle plan is going to be giving us an idea of what we should be doing next in the pen testing process. As we are moving along, we want to start thinking about what we want to do next, and we're going to want to start planning what other information we might need to gather as we go along in our process. We are also going to want to think about the prioritization of the information we gathered and start looking at what is most detectable and least detectable and what other information we could be gathering. So we might, for example, find usernames, host names, IP tables, things like that, and we might end up wanting to go a little bit deeper into the recon process. But enumeration is going to be giving us a little bit more information and a more of a plan in place that we can all work with. Now, when we are talking about enumeration, we are going to talk about choosing targets. So the idea is we want to start thinking about who we are going to be aiming for. Now, this could be specific jobs such as C-suite style jobs. We could be looking at specific devices or servers, pieces of hardware that we want to aim for. We could also be looking at people. Now, this is going to be varying company to company, and that's part of why the recon process is so important, because we wouldn't even know which pieces or people or jobs we want to aim for if we don't have a good idea of how the company is put together and where the vulnerable places might be. So, if we were doing this in person, we would be talking a little bit as a group and start picking some targets. So, what I would say is pause me here and start thinking about a large company. Now, again, remember, please do not actually do anything, but just start coming up with some ideas and thoughts of why you might pick particular targets. For example, why might you pick particular people, or why might you pick particular devices? And start thinking about why you would want to do that, the likelihood of being detected, and what are some pros and cons. Now, one of the things that we do want to think about as we think about the enumeration process, we really want to have a layered battle plan. We don't want everything to be riding on one specific thing. If we end up messing up as we're going through this and we end up alerting the company that we are, let's say, in the process of a pen test, that can actually have some very negative consequences to our test, because as soon as the company realizes they are under even simulated attack, hopefully they will be able to start having more defenses, which as pen testers is not what we want. We want to be able to have an accurate image of what the company looks like in general. So we want to make sure that we are prioritizing what is most likely to get caught and doing that only as a final resort or at the end. And we want to start with what is least likely to get caught and least likely to be a problem. So we want to have a time set for this plan as well. The battle plan is one piece, but we also want to think about what other pieces of information, what other recon might we find valuable, and how could we particularly go after it. So let's say, for example, it's a very large company and they have some systems administrators or sysadmins. Now, hopefully, the sysadmins have not posted their usernames and passwords, let's say, publicly on a website. If they have, obviously we have some other problems. But those might be really valuable or juicy targets. So as we are going through the enumeration process, it might be that one of the things that we are aiming for is trying to get their login information so that we can get even deeper into the system. But we're not going to know that until we start looking at what we have gathered from recon and starting the enumeration process. But obviously, if we just start, let's say, for example, brute forcing some sysadmin passwords under root, well, technically, yes, we could do that, but that's more likely to send up red flags than perhaps a different way of scanning the system or trying different things. So we want to make sure we're keeping all of that in mind. Now, a lot of pen testing will include some social engineering. Social engineering is becoming very popular in terms of both a thing that actual, sort of bad person hackers will do, and also something that companies are training against. So, social engineering will have phishing emails. We generally want to tailor these emails to the people or the company. So, for example, if you're tailoring it to a person, you want to think about the hobbies and interests of that person. If you're tailoring it to a company, you want to think about that particular company. So, like for example, if you're working for a healthcare company, something about HIPAA would be very valuable. If you're working for some manufacturing companies, talking about the ISO certifications might be really valuable. But if you switch that and you, let's say, email a hospital about the ISO certification for something, you're probably not going to get much of a response because they're not going to think it's relevant to them. You might also end up seeing some things with what's called vishing phone calls. One of the ways that people sometimes do this is what's called a mumble attack, where you basically mumble into the phone and hope that people will fill in the blanks. Sometimes you'll use technical jargon so that you can kind of confuse people into giving information that they would not normally give. There's also some options for social media scraping. So the attack surface mapper and the social attacker are some examples of programs that can be used in the process of scraping social media, but it is worth mentioning that these do actually violate the terms of service, so you need to be a little careful with that. So next we can start looking at hardware. So we might end up wanting to, for example, look at servers. Maybe we want to map our servers, so we want to ping the server. Is it actually up and running? We want to check the ports, which ports are open. So we might end up using tools such as Nmap or ZenMap. Please do not actually use these except under supervision in class. They can actually be dangerous and there are some things that can go wrong with them. We might end up wanting to do a little bit of look into the hardware in terms of what operating systems are people running. So we can look at banners, things that's going to have information about the system, the services that are being run, the version of the different applications, and the default ports for some of those applications. So for example, we know that if we're going to SSH into a server, it's default port 22, but you can actually change that in the server setup. So did the company do that? Did they leave port 22 open? Did they leave maybe some kind of trap behind port 22 so we don't necessarily want to look at that? So all of those are things that we would need to take into account. As we're going through this, we're also going to want to think about the location of the hardware. Is it actually in a real company? Is it somewhere else? Do they contract out to a third party? What's the network structure and are there desktop vulnerabilities? Is there forgotten hardware? So one of the things that'll happen at a lot of companies is there are some devices that very much don't get updated. So printers, fax machines, things like that are actually internet connected devices, but it's very uncommon for them to be updated. Now, if we end up looking at the network structure or the vulnerabilities, another thing that we'll actually see pretty frequently is older machines. Most companies don't actually upgrade necessarily on the frequency that you might expect. So you can actually see several versions of, let's say, for example, they're a Windows shop. They might not just have, Windows 11. They might have Windows 11, Windows 10, Windows 8, Windows 7, and they might have, 10 years worth of Windows machines. And sometimes there are some products that companies will use that are actually limited to specific versions of an operating system. So, for example, there's actually some applications for like accounting or healthcare that actually use specific previous versions of operating systems, like let's say Windows XP, which might be 20 years old, but that's what it was developed for. That's what they've updated. So that means they actually have to have a Windows XP machine somewhere. So these are the things that we want to think about and take into account when we're looking at the company and the industry the company is in. Now, normally we would do an activity, however, we're not going to do that here because I can't observe you while you're doing that. So I have an example of what it would look like. So what you're seeing here is an example of using Netcat and getting a bad request. And then you're also seeing what would happen with Nikto and what results you would get from Nikto. So you can see what would happen if these were actually run rather than running them yourself. Now, to avoid detection, one of the things that will happen as we go through this process is we need to make sure that we are avoiding detection as we are trying to do our enumeration plan. So for example, Nmap is actually really loud. Most systems will be able to tell if you're doing Nmap or Zenmap on one of their servers. So you're probably going to want to think about things like stealth options, looking at SYN and ACK or FIN packets and how you can use those to make Nmap not trigger so many things. We can also look at things like spoofing IP addresses, spoofing MAC addresses, using zombies or pivots so that we can get into the system without it getting tracked back to us as easily. We can do things with forged packets. Once we're starting to get sort of much more into the system, we can do things with decoys, distractions, or volume attacks. So you're basically sort of setting off something over in a different area so that you can work more quietly. Because if you set off, let's say, a very loud Nmap scan on a server that you've already finished looking through, all of the attention is going to be on that very loud Nmap scan, so you can have some peace and quiet working on the server that you maybe needed to give a little bit more attention to. It's also important that we think about, can we and have we identified any traps or triggers? Now, this can be a relatively difficult thing. Sometimes you can detect them, sometimes you can't, but that's part of what the recon process will hopefully do, is allow us to figure out, did they have anything set up? How can we avoid them? Now, normally I would do an activity where we would start looking at some more tools and try them. However, because this is online and you aren't in class, what I'm going to say is go look up a couple more tools, see how they would work, but don't actually try them. So that was the end of enumeration. Thank you, and I hope you're having a lovely day.